this is Steve with Vintauri RC, and today we are in Google Sketchup. We are looking at a finished product of one of my experimental designs that I've done and cut out on my CNC machine. I've had a number of people ask how I've got started with SketchUp and how they could work in SketchUp to design aircraft. So I thought I'd do my best to try to create a little bit of a tutorial here to help others get started. End result of these videos, we'll be looking at first just simple flat plate foamies such as this extra 300 that we've got drawn here, and then eventually maybe moving into more full fuse airframes or full built up airplanes and such. So that will be our goal. So I hope you stick with me. I hope you can learn something from me, and let's get started. All right, the first thing we need to do is go ahead and get SketchUp. You can find it by just going to sketchup.com or search for SketchUp on any web browser and search engine. You should bring you to a page that looks similar to this, and look at that. There's an RC car. How cool is that? Anyway, you'll want to go ahead and download SketchUp. It'll be the big red button right here for now. They may change the website, but what you're currently looking for is what's called SketchUp Make. They've got a few different versions. They've got SketchUp Pro, they've got Educational. We're looking for personal projects here, and that will bring you to SketchUp Make. And all you need to do is put in your email. Don't worry, they're not going to spam you too much. What your interest is, you could select whatever you want, engineering, game design. It really doesn't matter. They're just kind of seeing who's using it. So go ahead and select anything you want here, and select your operating system. It's pretty much the same between Windows and Mac. There's some minor differences visually, but great thing is, whichever platform you've got, go ahead and select that. You can read their license agreement. You'll need to agree to that. You can opt out of their news and tips emails, so check or uncheck that, and then go ahead and download SketchUp Make. Once it is downloaded, go ahead and install it, either from the executable or the DMG file, whether you're on Windows or Mac. And eventually, that will let you open up the program. All right, we are in SketchUp. After you've downloaded it and installed it, first time you open it, you should see this splash screen. It'll be fairly similar to this. Mine's the Pro version, but the free version will look very similar. What we're wanting to do is jump down to this template section. And SketchUp will ask you to select a template by default. They've got a number of different ones based on the style of design work you'll be doing, whether it's architectural, Google Earth for larger stuff, engineering in feet and meters. But what I find working best is in inches or millimeters using their product design and word working. So select whether you're more familiar with inches or millimeters, or whether your project dictates that. Go ahead and select the template that you would like. Don't worry, you can always come back to this screen and change it. But to get started, I'm going to select the product design woodworking inches template. And then I like to uncheck this always show on startup box, just because I don't need it popping up each time. If you do want to get back into it, I'll show you here in just a second. We'll start using SketchUp. This will be then your default screen. If you do want to go back there, just go to Help, Welcome to SketchUp, and you can go back to their template sections. But again, we're jumping in, working with inches. So here we are. We're at our main screen. We're in a perspective view, so we're not straight on any specific view. We have the Getting Started toolbar is what they call this up here. They've got some very basic tools. We're going to be modifying that eventually. But in this video, we'll just go through some of the basics of SketchUp just to get you familiarized with what we're doing here. So, looking at these tools across the top, your first one, that is select. That is this black arrow. And we can either click on objects, we can drag left to right, right to left. You'll see that the boxes are different. This is a dashed line. This is a solid line. The solid line means it's going to select anything that's completely within that box. And the dashed line will be anything that touches inside that box. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. The eraser tool, this simply will allow you to erase individual items, objects, or groupings, depending on how you have them set. All right, our line tool, this is one of the main tools we'll be using, is for drawing lines. And you left click once, which starts your line, and then you can tell it basically which direction you want to go with your line. SketchUp does like to snap, so you'll notice at different points, depending on what it's relating to, it'll snap to certain objects. So here it is snapping to the red axis. So it's going to run parallel to that axis. And as long as it's highlighted red and showing that little on red axis tag down by our cursor, you will be right on that red axis. If you want to confirm that you're going to stay on that axis, you can hold shift, and no matter what way you move your mouse up or down, it's going to stay on that red axis. So that's just a little bit about snapping. We'll get more into it as we deal with other objects and tools. But like I said, you can start your line, you can freehand draw a line. There it just ended at another endpoint. I can come up here and draw another endpoint. You'll see that it's still continuing to want to snap to different objects. Another thing you can do with lines is you can draw a specific length line. So if up here on this top part I wanted to have a 10-inch line, I would just simply start going in the direction I want to go to your keyboard and type in 10, and since we selected inches, it's going to do a 10-inch line. There, it automatically ended my line at 10 inches. Now once you're done drawing your series of lines, you hit escape, that clears it out, and you're free to start elsewhere with your lines, such as over here. I can draw a grouping of lines, or I can move to another tool. Now jumping back to the select tool, here we can see by default we can select an individual object just by clicking on that. And right now, since these are all separate entities, I'm selecting one line at a time. If I want to select multiple items, I can hold down the shift key, and you see it has the plus and minus. So as long as I'm clicking on unselected items, it'll select them and add them to our selection. But if I go, well, I really didn't mean to select this line, I can click on it again and it'll unselect it. So holding shift allows you to do that. You'll notice that control will only allow you to add, so if I click on it again, it's not going to unselect it. If I hold control shift, it'll only let me subtract. Now again, I mentioned you can drag and click with the selection tool. So dragging from left to right will select everything that's within the box that I drew around. So you notice everything was in there, but if I was to come up here, it's only going to select this top line because that's the only item completely within that box. So that's kind of useful if you have a number of items in this area that are still attached to others, but you only want to select the ones in that area. You can drag that. Now if you go from right to left, anything that touches within that area will still get selected. So you notice that these two lines in addition get selected, but not this bottom line because it wasn't in that area. So there's just a few different ways to use the selection tool. All right, moving on from the line selection, we also had the erase. So here I've got a selection already. I've got a grouping selected. So if I click on just one of them, it's going to ignore that selection and just erase the one I clicked on. So I can drag across items and erase them. You just do an Alt backspace, bring that back, or I can individually click on items and erase them. And Alt backspace is like doing an undo once for each time. So eraser tool basically very simple, just erasing a single item at a time to correct many errors you made. All right, we've got other shapes we can deal with besides just lines. We have our square rectangular tool. That very simply just will draw a specific size shape. We can freehand it like I'm doing here and just say, okay, that's the size we want. Or if we want a specific size, we can tell where our start point is. Say I want a 10 by 10 box, so I would type 10, 10, and that appears down in our lower right down here. So again, 10, 10, hit enter, and it will draw a 10 by 10 box for you. Now you'll notice these have kind of the blue face filled in. SketchUp by default is going to consider that you're planning on working in 3D, so it's going to fill in those areas because it also wants to deal with lines and faces. So those are the basics of the squares. We can do the same thing with circles. It does its measurements based on the radius of the circle. So you start your circle at the center, you bring it out. Again, you can freehand it, or you can type in a radius of a specific size. So if I want a 10-inch circle, I'd do a 5-inch radius, and there I have a 10-inch circle. We have polygons that you can select from. Again, it's going off of the radius, and it's just another default shape. And then you have the default arc tool, which you select your width and then the bulge of the arc. And again, you can do the height of the bulge, you can type in. So if you wanted a 4-inch bulge, there you go. All right, those are the basic shapes that Google SketchUp works with in default. We'll be adding some other tools for drawing more specific shapes, but we'll get into that as we add toolbars. Next we have the tools for manipulating objects that we've drawn or brought into SketchUp. The first one here is the PushPull Tool, and what this does is it interacts with faces. It won't interact with just a line. As you see, when I try to hover over there, I'm going to get the little no symbol that it can't work with that. But when it hovers over a face, it'll highlight it, and that means it can interact with that. So the push-pull basically is what it is you can pull or you can push the object into stretching it out, and it creates kind of a three-dimensional object here. So we can also, again, set the distance. So if we wanted to bring this up 10 inches, we would simply type 10, hit enter, and there we have our cube is 10 inches up. It also will interact if we were to draw another line on here, another box like that. We would be able to come down here with our push-pull tool and select either the outer ring as such or the inner ring. And if we bring that down 10 inches, bring that down 10 inches, you'll notice that we now have a hollow space in our object. So just a couple ways you can do the push-pull. Again, it works on the faces. So here we would have a cylinder popping up and down, depending on how far we make it work. All right, our offset tool is very convenient for creating a very precise offset line from a pre-existing edge. So what you want to do first is select your edge. So we're going to select this box, and I'm going to come up to our offset tool. And you see it's trying to snap to the edge of that object. So select anywhere on there. You can bring it in or out from that line or that edge. And you can specify a distance. So we'll go ahead and just say 2 inches, and it's going to draw a 2-inch offset line, and it's actually going to create a face. So if you didn't want the face, just select it, hit delete, or use your erase tool, and now you have an offset of this object, or this edge I should say, in 2 inches. We also have our move tool. The move tool is very actually I find it very useful, very powerful for more than just moving objects. Now you'll notice it's highlighting just one individual object at a time. So if I was to take any of these and move them, it's going to skew the rest of them in relation to where I'm moving this line. So if we wanted to move this entire drawing, again, we'd want to go and select it using one of our methods for selecting. And then we can select our move tool. We can grab it anywhere we want, move it around, and that's going to be relative to the starting point of where we grabbed it. So even if we grab outside of that object, if I was to have my move tool, but this is highlighted and I click over here, it's still going to grab that object and move it in relation to where I'm moving my cursor from my starting point. So the easiest way is to actually grab it at a point that you can reference well. So I like grabbing it at an end point or a midpoint, and we'll move it around. Now you can also do very precise movements, whether it's on an axis. You see here that the line is red or green or even blue as I'm going up. In addition to that, we can also select how far we want to move it. So if I want to move this over 2 inches on the red axis, I drag it on the right axis and then hit 2, and it will automatically, as you see down here, move it 2 inches. Now in addition to that, I can do a move while copying. What that does is it will copy the object and move the copied object but leave the original in place. To do that, we start with our move tool, hit control, and you'll notice there's a little plus symbol to the lower right of my icon. That means I'm going into a move and copy mode. So what we do is we click to grab the copy, and then we can move it again specified from our starting point. We start with the end point. We can drag it over on the red axis. We can manually move it anywhere else, but if I drag it on the red axis and say I want to bring it over 14 inches this way, I type in 14, that highlights there. And then additionally, I can make an array and say, okay, I want to move and copy that one 14 inches and then repeat that 3 times. So I type in x3 and it will do that 3 times, keeping the same distance relative to my original one with each copy. So this is great for making an array of items such as wing ribs on a wing. So many different ways you can use the move command, and remember it will snap 2 points. So if I wanted to move, say, this line, and I wanted to move this endpoint and line it up with that endpoint, that's all I would have to do. And now these two are going to interact with them being attached at that point. All right, the next tool we want to talk about is our rotate tool. And this can interact with individual parts of an object or a whole object, depending on how they're grouped. And it will do it on various planes. So you see, as we grab the tool, by default it's going into the blue plane. That would be the top-down plane. Like if we were on the top of a surface, that's the plane we would see there. You also have our red face or plane, and then our green face or plane. So you want to keep that in mind as you're moving them, and if you're not on an exact one, it's going to show up as black because it's not snapping exactly to one of those planes. So what this will do is, first we want to select which plane we want to rotate in and make sure that that's correct. So here we have it in the blue, over here we have it in the red, and over here we have it in the green. Now on a 2D object, it's pretty easy just to have it stuck as blue, but if you wanted to, say, rotate it up 90 degrees along the green axis so that it was standing vertical, you can come over to an object like this, and sometimes I'll actually draw a cube to have these faces. So if we wanted to rotate, say, this object on the green, first thing we want to do is we want to make sure we have it selected. So I'm going to go ahead and, oops, wrong direction, select that. We're going to come up to our rotate tool. Then I'm going to come over on this object, make sure that I'm getting the green protractor type tool, hold shift, and that will lock it into that plane. See, no matter where we move now, it's going to stay on the green. And here now we want to select our point where we're going to rotate about. So on this one, I want to do it either on this point or this point to get it kind of square and leave it on the surface. So we'll click on this point, and then we drag our handle out to another end as our reference point. We click there, and now we are in kind of our rotate tool. You see, right now we can freehand it, and down in our lower right is showing our angle that we're at. So we could try to manually guess, but if we know the exact angle, say we want it upright 90 degrees, just type in 90, hit enter, and that will lock it in right at a 90-degree rotation. So again, just keep in mind which surface or which plane you're trying to rotate it about, which axis. If you need, draw a cube to lock it in, hold shift, and then click your endpoint, click your handle, and then rotate it around, either by hand or by using the keyboard. And then finally we have our scale tool, and on a 2D object you'll just have your 8 points here, and depending on where you grab them, if you grab in the corners, you'll see it comes up as uniform scale, and that's going to keep the object the same throughout. It's not going to change any of the aspects. However, if we grab one here, it's only going to scale in the green, but it's going to keep the other the same. And then again here, it's going to scale in the red. So if you're trying to keep everything the same aspect, you want to grab opposite corners to maintain it as a uniform scale. Otherwise, it will scale in that specific plane. Now, if we come over to a 3-dimensional object, you're going to have even more points to select from. As you see here, you've got 8 on each surface, and depending on which one you grab, it will scale in. Here it will scale red and blue. Here it will scale just red. Here it's a uniform. Here's green and blue. So you kind of get the idea that it's gonna scale certain objects or certain faces and planes, but not the other. So you also can manually select down the lower right the size of the scale. So it starts out at 1. So if we grab it, we're at 1. And we can manually slide it going up to a point. Here's 1.5, down to 0.5. Or we can type in 0.25, and that would be a quarter size. All right, we have a few more tools that I will show you on the basic bar. The first one here, we have the measurement tool. This does two things. You can physically measure a length of something, so you can go point to point. Here it says 10 and 25/64ths, or kitty corner, we could say 14/24 or 27/64ths, things like that. So you can double check if you need something a specific size, you can double check that is what it is. The other thing it can do is create guidelines. So you see here we've just kind of randomly drawn one that you could specify that length. You could say, okay, I need to bring one out 3 inches, hit enter, and that's going to give you a point out 3 inches. Or we can draw an infinite one by just clicking on a line or an axis, and it will draw that and run it infinitely. So if we wanted to make sure that all objects were on this line, we could put it, line it up right on that edge, and then we could grab everything else, say, and use our move command and say, okay, I want to snap that to that line, or we'll grab this entire thing and say we want to snap that down to this line, and you get the idea there. So you can use guides that way. You can also create a grid. So if you wanted to create yourself a working area, you could say, okay, come in 2 inches from that edge and 2 inches from that edge, and keep everything 2 inches off of our edges that way. You can also say, okay, I need to bring it up 24 inches from this one, and in 48, and then everything inside this box, you would have working in a 2 by 4 foot area. So that's basically what you can do with the measuring tool. You can create guide points, guidelines, and you can do basic measurements. This will take an area of an object and tell you what the surface area is. If you click on it, this one will tell you it's 104.72 inches square on this face surface. So that would be, we would be looking at that face surface right there. I don't use this a whole lot. You may find it useful in some things or not, but it is there. And then the paint bucket is more of a finishing type tool. You can add colors. They also have other textures such as stone. There are some metal and wood as well. So once you get to a point where you're wanting to make your product look a little more finished, you can add various textures to the sides to give it more of a realistic look. Finally, we have our view tools. The orbit one, of course, you can use with your left mouse button this way. However, I normally just use, by default, it's our third button or our mouse wheel, scrolling in and out zooms. Holding down your third mouse button, which is often your scroll wheel, will let you orbit around. Pan will let you move side to side, up and down without orbiting around an object. The zoom obviously lets you zoom in and out, and this is just a zoom to your extents type button. Finally, over here we have a few extra plugins that Google adds. There's the Google Maps, and then there's the 3D Warehouse, which I find useful because you can actually search for objects that you might want to use, such as a brushless motor, and you can pull in an object that someone else has shared that they've created. We can load this directly in our object, place it in there, and you'll see we have a small CD-ROM brushless motor that we could put into our model as well. So those are the basic features of the default menus with Google SketchUp. Like I say, we're going to go ahead and change this and add some extensions, add some toolbars that I find useful, and we'll do that in the next video right before we jump into starting our drawing. So stay tuned, stick with me. Hopefully I can teach you something. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them down below. Go ahead and subscribe if you want to make sure you are aware when I'm able to upload and post new tutorials. And finally, if you have any help for me, leave those in the comment section as well. I'm learning this just as much as everybody else is, so definitely I'd love to hear your feedback on if you've got some tips or tricks that we can share with everybody else. So in the meantime, I hope you enjoyed this, and we'll see you soon.